Amen. Well, it's been a good morning so far, and we look forward to another time here. And we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and we're going to begin in verse 20. We're in the chapter, the resurrection. This whole chapter speaks of the resurrection. It's one of the most important things that we need to realize, that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a cardinal doctrine. And part of the gospel is preaching the resurrection. We're saved, and the gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's the good news that we have. So we need to study this whole chapter here on the resurrection and start with verse 20. In the other first verses, we see where there are some people who actually denied the resurrection and didn't believe it actually happened. And the Lord, Paul talked to them about that. And now we're saying here in verse 20, but now is Christ risen from the dead and become the firstfruit of them that slept. So we see that, but now is Christ risen. There was a question there, and now this is an emphatic statement that this is not a question, it's a fact that Christ is risen from the dead and become the firstfruit of them that slept. Now last week I talked a little about the firstfruit, but I want to just go back and review that a little bit. The firstfruit is whenever we have a harvest. If you've got say you've got a wheat field, and I don't know how big your field is. When I grew up, it was 40 acres. And 40 acres, you can't have a garden anymore. But if you had a 40-acre field of wheat, the wave offering from Leviticus, you would go to the northeast corner and get a handful of wheat, and southeast, and you go to all four corners, and in the middle, and you would take this bundle of wheat down to the priest, and he would wave this as a wave offering before God, and you would bring him this wave offering and give this to God. The wave offering is to signify that there's a large harvest to follow. So when Jesus Christ became the first fruit from the dead, Jesus Christ is the first person who ever rose from the dead with a glorified body. Now we've seen other people that's been raised from the dead, but they were raised from the dead in their normal human body. They died again. But Jesus Christ was raised from the dead with a spiritual body, a heavenly body, that will never die again. And so he is the first fruit, which is a signification of God that there's many, many more to follow. And there are millions and billions of Christian people from the time Christ has been resurrected who have died and been buried. But one day, when the Lord comes back, there's going to be a resurrection. There's going to be a resurrection of the just. And Paul is talking here about the resurrection of the just, the Christians. He's not talking about a general resurrection. There are some people who believe a general resurrection, that all of us will be resurrected at one time. We will not all be resurrected at one time. First resurrection is for the saints, the children of God. And then some 1,000 years later, there'll be another resurrection of the unsaved. So Paul is talking in this chapter, he's talking to Christians, and he's talking to them. And he become the first fruits of them that slept. And so by the time Paul writes this to Corinth, many of the Christians who have been saved have died. This is several years, some 20, 24 years after Christ was resurrected. And 20 or 24 years' time, some of the Christians had died and fallen asleep in the Lord. And Paul said some of them, the fruits of them that sleep, first fruit of them that sleep. So those who are in the dead, those that we consider today the realm of the dead. That's what we talk about. They're in the realm of the dead. They've lived and they've died, and now they're in the realm of the dead. But those people are, in God's eyes, they are asleep. And one day he's going to wake them up. He's going to wake them up with a trump of God. And they're going to be woken from this sleep, and they're going to resurrect in a glorified body, an eternal body, a heavenly body that will never die again, never know pain and suffering and sorrow. It's going to be a glorified body. Jesus Christ is the first one that ever had that kind of a body. And we saw him when he went to meet with the apostles. They was in a room with the door closed. They were afraid because the Jews were against them as they had been against Christ, and they had the door closed. We're meeting there, and suddenly Jesus stood in the room with them. He just passed through the door, through the wall. With his spiritual body, he was not hindered by physical things. And so we're going to wind up one day with a body like Christ. He is the first fruit. He is the assurance of God that we will be resurrected. And we need to hold this in our heart and in our mind, that this is a truth of God. Verse 21, for since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. Since by man came death, we see in Romans 5:12, for death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. And we also see death, sin came by men, and with sin came death, and death had passed upon all men, for all have sinned. So we see, how did death get into the world? When God created Adam and Eve and put them in the Garden of Eden, he didn't create death. He created them a living soul. And had Adam and Eve failed to sin, they would still be alive. And we would be in a altogether different situation ourselves, wouldn't we? We wouldn't be here today in the state that we're in now, because death came by man. When God put Adam and Eve in the garden, he gave them all the trees of the garden for fruit to eat. And he said they could eat of any tree in the garden except one tree. And this one tree, God said, you can't eat of that one tree. Well, the devil came to Eve one day and said, Eve, look what God's denying you. Isn't that the way temptation starts? You know, your parents tell you you can't do something, and you say, look what they're denying me. My parents are denying me having all the fun I want to have. No, your parents are denying you sin. Your parents are denying you trouble. And so the devil came to Eve and said, look at this tree. Isn't it pretty? And she looked. And yes, very pretty. Well, isn't it a fruit to be desired? Yes, it's a fruit to be desired. Somebody told me one time that forbidden fruit is always the most desirable fruit. And so it was forbidden, and yet it was desirable to her. And she took and ate of that tree. And God said, in the day that you eat thereof, you shall die. And so she took and ate, and she gave to Adam, and he ate. And immediately their eyes were opened to their sinful condition, which they just fell into. And then some years later, Adam died physically and Eve died physically. But that moment they ate of that fruit, they died spiritually. Their spirit was separated from God. They died, and they were in a state of death. And so death came into the world by man. Now you and I are the offsprings of Adam. Adam and Eve were placed outside of the Garden of Eden because they could no longer live in paradise because they were now sinners. And in paradise, there is no place for sinners. In heaven, there is no place for sinners. And so Adam and Eve were placed outside the garden. They didn't have any children until after they were placed outside of the garden. And they began to have children, and Adam lived 30 some years, I think. I may be wrong. I know it was over 500. And had sons and daughters. And Eve is the mother of all living. And so we see that by man, death came into the world. And since we were born outside of the Garden of Eden to a fallen Eve and a fallen Adam, they could not pass on to us what they did not have. And so they passed on to us a warped, stunted soul and spirit. And so this was passed on to us. And then you notice he says, for by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. And so man brought death into the world, and Jesus Christ, the God-man, Jesus Christ, the God-man, came into the world, and he lived without sin. He was crucified and buried and rose again. And so by man came also the resurrection. of the dead. So death came by man through sin.